Good evening, everyone. I'm Jim Falk, and what a wonderful way for us to begin our program to see young leaders who I think aspire to be probably quite different than some of the people we're going to be talking about this evening. In fact, this month is International Education Month. So it's an opportunity for World Affairs Councils across the country to highlight some of the important work that they do in high schools and elementary schools across the country. And in fact, I'm especially pleased that Richard Shaffer is moderating tonight's conversation because he and his wife, Linda, who was on our board of directors for the World Affairs Council for a number of years, have been stalwart supporters of our education program. So it's great to have you all with us tonight. Idi Amin, Franco, Qaddafi, Hitler, Hussein, Mussolini, Pinochet, Putin. What a cast of characters. They're all principal players in the tour of tyrannies of the last century. Our guest tonight asserts that ours is the age of the strongman, men marked by their dependence on corruption and censorship and the neglect of the public good. And so is it fair then that she includes the 45th president of the United States on this roster? Let's see what she has to say. Today we welcome Dr. Ruth Ben-Ghiat. She's a professor of history and Italian studies at NYU, New York University, and an expert on fascism and authoritarian leaders. Her new book, which was just published today, is entitled Strongmen, Mussolini to the Present. And as I said, she'll be joined in conversation with Richard Shaffer. You can always purchase copies of books featured on the World Affairs Council programs by going to interabangbooks.com. And remember that you can get a 10% discount by just typing in the code dfwworld, and not just on Strongmen, but for any books that might be in your shopping cart. So let me tell you now a little bit about Richard Shaffer. He's a longtime journalist. He has written for Forbes, Fortune, New York Times, the Wall Street Journal. And before moving to Dallas, and I'm glad he did, he managed the private capital markets division of Dow Jones and Company and advised institutional investors about technologies for the world poorest. Again, let me remind you to keep up with our programs. Just go to our YouTube channel, and of course, you can guess it, it's DFW World. Richard, I turn it over to you.
Thank you, Jim. Professor, welcome. Somebody's published in 3 or 4 places. I was blown away. You've been in the Atlantic, CNN, Washington Post. You're quoted dozens of places. You're profiled in the New Yorker. I looked on your website and I see your CV. There's a dozen single-spaced pages of things you've published. Yeah, I'm impressed. What can I say? So, Strongmen, published today, as Jim said, details the corruption, the propaganda, the violence, and what you call male menace that authoritarians use to get power and to keep it. And to your credit, the Times has selected your book as one of its books to watch. So I want you all to read the book, and as you read it, you'll want to know more. This is your chance. So use the Q&A box and let us hear from you. Welcome again, Professor. You know, a lot of the book deals with this whole century of authoritarian regimes. Do you think most Americans are familiar with this history? And if not, what are the consequences?
I think that we Americans are in a very fortunate position of never having had a foreign occupation, never had an experience of dictatorship. There are plenty of people living in the country who have fled from places that have had illiberal rule, either communist dictatorships in the past or juntas, military juntas. And I think that it's a great fortune, but it's been right now a bit of a liability because we don't know what the signs are of the erosion. Perhaps we don't know as well what the signs of the erosion of democracy are. And when our current president started coming to power and talked about in January 2016, talked about shooting someone on Fifth Avenue. And this was very similar to the rhetoric of Duterte and Bolsonaro when they were running for office. And for me, this was a red flag. So I started writing about Donald Trump's illiberal tendencies. And the first emails I got from people, besides people who didn't like what I was writing, were people who had escaped dictatorships or other kinds of difficult situations who said, well, I've been so worried, and it doesn't seem like many other people are paying attention. So we've had this luxury, and I think we're getting a big education right now in America.
So your book deals a lot with fascism, but how does that differ from authoritarian? Is there an important distinction that we should pay attention to?
So the book is, I felt it was time to look back on 100 years of what I use the term authoritarianism, which encompasses fascism. And so the book is divided into 3 historical periods. So the fascist period, and which, along with communism, and started in the 1920s with Mussolini, was the foundation of this kind of playbook that I describe, of these tools of rule. And then you have the period of military coups after World War II. And I have Pinochet in Chile. I single out certain people who I follow along. We get to know them. Qaddafi, Mobutu in the Congo. And then we get to the new authoritarians, as I call them. And this is when the Cold War ends. And so here we have authoritarianism really evolving. And so you have figures who are pioneers of this new illiberal style of government, like Berlusconi, who never destroys democracy, but he bends the law and he controls the media to an extent that he has a personality cult that no one had had since Mussolini. And so today, authoritarianism works differently. So the idea was not to compare, to say that America is like a fascist state. That's silly. The idea is to have a historical look back and a historical context for things going on today. So authoritarianism is this broader term because, like, Erdogan is not a fascist. Even Putin is a post-communist. He's not a fascist. So that's why I like the term authoritarianism as a kind of catch-all for illiberal government.
So what do these strongmen you talk about today, the strongmen today, what do they have in common? Is it character? Is it political philosophy? Is it temperament? Is it leadership style? What ways are they similar?
One of the most interesting parts of the research was finding how similar these men are. Actually, throughout the century, they have certain traits that allow them to get to power: ruthlessness, opportunism, many of them very skilled at media. And this is true of Mussolini. He used newsreels. Modi has Instagram, and he has holograms to present himself at rallies. So the media have changed, or the mechanisms have changed, but they all have certain temperaments. And then, of course, each has its national context. So one thing that stands out among those who are sitting leaders, let's say, but is very similar to the past, is that they construct these systems of government that are full of kind of buffers for themselves. And they create what political scientists call inner sanctums. And they fill them with flatterers and with family members. And unfortunately for them, it ends up being a quite counterproductive system of governance. It's a divide and rule. And so nobody who really is going to tell them the truth can do very well. You get demoted, or you get transferred out. And so after a while, they start believing their own propaganda. Now, this inner sanctum is very convenient, though, for any corruption schemes they have going on. So loyalty becomes the requisite for serving them, not expertise. And that's not how you get good governance. And so you get a government like Putin's, which is highly inefficient. You know, Gazprom was rated by barons as one of the worst performing businesses in the world, but it performs well to enrich Putin and his cronies. So the purpose of government is a fundamentally different purpose, and the structure reflects that.
So we're looking at or saying, what are the warning signs? What should we be watching for, or what should we have watched for?
And are you thinking in America, or?
Specifically, I'm really concerned about America. So right here, what should we be watching for? It doesn't have to be America. It could be, Uruguay for all I care. What are the signs?
So I've already mentioned one of them. It's been really fascinating to track these recurrent conditions that happen. You have individuals who are of extremist temperament often, and they preach violence. They claim to that they will save the nation. They are extremely savvy with the media, but they depend on conservative elites to bring them in the system. So one of the I think very sad things that happens is that in this case it was the GOP, in Italy and Germany a century ago it was conservatives, but this has happened every single time, that conservatives and political elites think that they can use this outsider or this person who's trying to get to power, and then they end up being controlled by him. So one sign is that when this person makes it clear very early on that he's not going to play by the rules. And there we have when Trump was talking about shooting someone on Fifth Avenue. This is no political candidate operating in a democracy does such a thing. And so he was testing us. And this is something we can look out for. Again, we have Duterte was testing. Duterte even told Filipinos, he said, you shouldn't vote for me because if I win, it's going to be bloody. So they throw down these kind of trial balloons. And one of my maxims is that authoritarians often tell you what they're going to do. And so Trump, with that comment, which was a milestone, I believe, he said, not only I could shoot someone on Fifth Avenue and I wouldn't lose any followers. So he was kind of telling us that he was capable of associating with violence or being violent. And he also believed he was above the law. So one principle of authoritarianism across the century has been they are leaders who can get away with things that ordinary people cannot, whether it's violence, whether it's corruption. And many times they don't go to jail, but everybody around them goes to jail. That's one of the lessons of the book. Whether it's Pinochet or Qaddafi made a bad end, but Berlusconi, the personal lawyers of authoritarians often go to jail, but the leaders don't.
So I want to remind you all to ask questions. The Q&A box is open. I have a whole lot more, but welcome questions from those in the audience. Let me push back a little bit. Donald Trump has been called, quote, the worst president ever in the history of these United States. But in the election, he received more votes than any candidate in our history except Joe Biden. How should we think about that?
So there are many people who, and if you read anything by me, you will know I am not a fan of Donald Trump. And there are many people who talk about him being lazy, all he wants to do is golf, he's incompetent, and he's just a weak individual and a weak president and a weak authoritarian who hasn't done much damage. And I would beg to differ. And what we're seeing now, which we can come back to, where he is refusing to, even people like Erdogan are congratulating Biden, but he's refusing to recognize that there'll be a transition. And today his government issued a budget for February, as though he's going to be there in February. And of course, Mike Pompeo, you may have seen this, said, yes, there'll be a transition to the second Trump administration. So I see Trump as extremely successful at the autocratic game. And what I've been trying to get people to see is that, and this goes back to your first question, like we've always had a democracy, how does this, does this blind us? He's never been playing a democratic game. He's been playing an autocratic game. Those are the rules that he's using. So by those rules, he's been incredibly successful. He has built a personality cult that is equal to the personality cults of other despots. And this is why 70 million plus people is one reason they voted for him, even though he's mismanaged in, I think, a criminal fashion, the coronavirus pandemic and all the other things that have gone on. Even though he, even the news that Putin had a bounty on American soldiers' heads, nothing has swayed his partners in the GOP from supporting him. And so this domestication of the party, this construction of the personality cult are huge successes by Donald Trump, but they're not very healthy for a democracy.
Well, there's some who would push back and say success is not a word I want to associate with Trump. He's not so much an authoritarian as immature, ignorant, insecure, irresponsible, incompetent. And there are plenty of people who say that about him. Is he really good at being an authoritarian?
Here's my view, that we can't have a blanket definition of what authoritarianism means. It's going to look different in every time and place. That's why everybody's pushing me always to call him a fascist, because I work on fascism. I will never, ever call him a fascist, because that's misleading. I keep the word fascist for 100 years ago or 80 years ago. But what he's done, this is why I have these principles in the book of these tools of rule: corruption, incitements to violence, machismo, propaganda, and the myth of national greatness. MAGA, make America great, because it always has to be make the America great again, make the country great again. And if we take corruption, Trump is actually, you could say, well, he's always playing golf, right? Well, what he's actually doing is working extremely hard at turning the office of the presidency into a machine to promote and make money for Trump properties. Because until COVID came and ruined his traveling, he was spending 1 day out of every 3, and this has been documented by the Washington Post and other papers, 1 day out of 3 was spent at a Trump property. So the way I see it is he's not in office to govern according to a traditional presidential definition of the term. He's in office to govern in ways that match what authoritarians do today, making money from private office, from public office, turning it into a source of private money, enriching his cronies and his family. He has a clan there, that's very typical, and spreading and mainstreaming extremist ideas. So all of them do this, and I don't see that as conforming to democratic governance. So instead of saying he's a bad authoritarian, we have to recognize, what authoritarianism looks like in America. And I think that it looks like Donald Trump. He's one version. Could someone else come along who doesn't want to golf and is much more focused and persecute more people? Of course. And some people have made that argument. But I think that until we take seriously the damage he's done to the institutions, think about this is the World Affairs Council. I want to cry when I think what he's done to the Department of State, how he's degraded the act of diplomacy. Thousands and thousands of diplomats have had to leave. That's not somebody who's done nothing. And I think we just haven't been in a position to assess it all yet.
So you've talked about some of the effects of the presidency on the fundamentals of our democracy. Do you see this impact as lasting?
It depends. If he were reelected and had another 4 years, I think that the types of things that he and William Barr have been trying to do would be greatly accelerated. So as it is now, he's only been there for a few years. And this is why people say, well, how could you be calling him authoritarian? He's not doing what Putin's doing. But Putin and Erdogan and Orban started somewhere. They've been there a long time. So it's not too late to reverse many of these damages. In fact, I was very heartened to see that a news story that Biden wants to issue executive orders his first days in office to, reverse some of these measures that have been so harmful. And there would be a kind of outflow of people who were there, who were lackeys and ideologues, who were, debasing the civil service. So there would be those changes, and hopefully a respect for science and respect for professionalism would return. So things can be repaired. And I'm very thankful that I think we were at a crossroads, and the election has saved us from the consolidation of some of the worst tendencies.
So here's a question from Luca Filippone. He says, I'm an Italian. Mussolini is still very famous in Italy, especially in the young generation. The young generation still loves him. Why would that?
I lost your sound for a minute. You're saying, why would that be?
He says, I'm Italian, and you're fluent in Italian. You go to Italy, you've studied the history of it. This man asserts that Mussolini is still very famous, and the young generation still loves him. Do you think that's true? And if so, why? What accounts for that?
Buonasera. There he is. I think you're right. He is still very beloved. I think that one of the reasons that these men have an enduring appeal is that they were very, very good at presenting a certain picture of their states as efficient, as productive. And one of the myths of the Mussolini era was that he made the trains run on time. Now, certain trains ran on time. They were the trains that catered to tourists, but in a police state where censorship forbade, I've looked into this, where censorship forbade any reporting of accidents, of strikes. There were no strikes, there were no work slowdowns. So it's very hard and anti-fascist exiles published a lot. Salvemini published a lot of articles about the distorting of fascist statistics, especially including about the transport industry. So it's very hard to assess, what they actually did, but these myths live on. And Mussolini, although I'm no fan of Mussolini, he does not get his due as he gets overshadowed by Hitler, and this is a mistake because there are very good reasons people concentrate on Hitler, but Mussolini was a pioneer of the model of authoritarianism that's actually more, it's more apropos of how things work today in some ways, because Mussolini was a prime minister of a democracy for 3 years. And then he declared dictatorship to escape a special investigation, which seems very contemporary. There was an investigation and he was being named in a crime. He had assassinated a socialist leader. And he declared dictatorship to shut down this investigation. But he ruled in a democracy for 3 years. So today, authoritarianism is an evolution, not a revolution. And when we think about Hitler, who came in and immediately did a bunch of stuff, this was partly because Hitler was a huge admirer of Mussolini. And I tell this story of their kind of, tormented friendship. And he looked up to him so much so that he had a bust of Mussolini on his desk. And some Nazis didn't like this, and they accused him of suffering from, quote, Mussolini intoxication. But he didn't care. And then, of course, the tables turned and Mussolini became, kind of like a semi-prisoner in World War II of this German puppet state, the Republic of Salo. But Mussolini has a lot to teach us about a model of authoritarianism that had effects all over the world. And that may be my next study, is Mussolini in a global framework.
So other than through military action, this is from Marco Delaria, question, he says, other than through military action, how are strongmen removed? How do countries get rid of them?
Some, as many of you will know, some are removed in revolutions like Qaddafi. And one of the most, I think the most interesting chapter I wrote was it's called Endings. It's like how they leave. And psychologically, what happens when they feel that their power is threatened. And how, for example, Putin became very obsessed during the Arab Spring, and he got very worried that he was going to end up like Qaddafi. And indeed, 2011, 2012, he comes back to the presidency and he really takes a much harder line. And Qaddafi, as some of you will know, started cooperating with Western authorities in 2000s to avoid ending up like Saddam Hussein. So they're influenced by each other's bad ends, let's say. But I have on my mind a lot these days Augusto Pinochet in Chile. because he was the rare strongman who was voted out of office after 17 years of dictatorship. And yeah, there he is. And it's a very inspiring story how Chileans mobilized for years to prepare for this election, which, you know, they had been stripped off the voter rolls. And so they had to register millions and millions of voters. And another thing that's quite relevant is Pinochet had over a year after he was voted out until he actually left. And he spent a lot of that time trying to sabotage the new democracy. So he stacked the Supreme Court with friendly justices, and he passed all kinds of measures that would protect his people, conceal torture records, do all kinds of things that would minimize the damage to his legacy and protect knowledge of his crimes.
I want to ask you a little bit about, I want to build up questions from Donna Well and Susan Barzilay, which are very similar. Donna and Susan ask, how do you extricate yourself? What happens if the person retains power? These seem to me to be asking basically, it's unlikely that President Trump will spend his last days in exile. Maybe he'll become the next Rush Limbaugh or Sean Hannity, or maybe make a fortune selling ads on his Twitter feed. What do you expect? Will Trump return, for example, in 2024?
So I know people talk about him going into exile or country, you know, to kind of save himself from prosecution. I don't really see that happening because he is typical of strongmen in his need to be adulated. And he needs his audience. He's got 70 million people who, for whatever, some are his core of hardcore devotees. Others voted for him for all kinds of other reasons, but he's not going to leave that public behind. So he may go into media. He has to be at the center of attention at all times. And here's another way he's been incredibly successful. You know, these strongmen they're people who have a mania for possession. And one of the things they like to possess is our attention. They like to monopolize our attention. And so I think as we will look back on Trump's kind of all caps tweets, there's a lot of anxiety of being irrelevant, of not being heard. So he's unlikely to give up that fan base. And indeed, we already heard that he's going to keep doing rallies. And another person who was like this was Berlusconi, who had many similarities between Berlusconi and Trump. And he too couldn't stay out of the limelight, was also a master of television, and kept holding, you know, kept holding rallies and public, public performances because he couldn't stand to not have the attention. He was used to this attention. He was a real showman and very, very effective. So I think that we haven't seen the last of Trump. And I do think that I've been very interested, and many of you may have seen this, in the grooming of Ivanka for some role, 2024 perhaps, if it's not going to be Trump. And I was quite appalled. It doesn't speak well of world leaders that 2 times they have allowed Ivanka to be in their photos. At the G20 in 2019, Ivanka was allowed to be in the world leader photo. That's appeasement of a certain sort. It's not good. It's never happened before. I've been watching very closely how Ivanka is being presented to us. This is a family that is highly skilled at optics, highly skilled at propaganda, and she's been presented 3 times among world leaders, and there has to be a reason for that.
So do you expect criminal trials of Donald Trump?
It's hard to say. I know that the Southern District of New York has an ongoing, all kinds of evidence and cases open. I'm not sure that after what happened with the acquittal of him by the Senate, I'm not sure, I think that it's just hard to speculate on that. But it is quite amazing that the Republicans fell into line for his acquittal, and that's another testament to the influence he has. So I think that doing a criminal trial of him when he's still so popular and so divisive and so ready to rile up people who have arms is quite risky. And I would say that there is a wild card in this America as part of a global strongman framework. No other country in peacetime has 500 million guns in private hands. And many people, it's not about having a shotgun to defend your property. People who have, I'm talking about people who have arsenals, who have rocket launchers, and we know this well. A volume of arms that's usually found only in countries where there's sectarian violence. So this has always been the wild card about America. And I think it's very sobering to think about that. If there is somebody who wants to weaponize unrest and polarization, we have to think about that. And that is off, there is no other country that would compare, because there is no other country in this situation.
Well, he could solve all that just by pardoning himself.
Yeah, I would expect, he's been extremely savvy his entire career at exploiting loopholes in tax, regulatory, legal systems. So I would expect him, some people have speculated he would put Pence in charge for the last few days of the presidency so he could be pardoned. That's possible. When there's somebody with his temperament, what they fear above all is losing their money, losing their reputation, and would do anything at all to avoid that. And that's why authoritarians are very dangerous when their power is threatened.
We still don't have his tax returns. Do you think Trump will abide in any way? This is from Christine Nederman. Do you think Trump will abide in any way with the Presidential Records Act? And we'll have a library of all his documents and papers and so forth?
No, I do not, because, and here again, Trump has conformed to authoritarian practice, not democratic practice, because authoritarianism is built on a repudiation of accountability and destruction of transparency. And these are things that have characterized Trump's behavior, Trump administration behavior from the start. And they're small things which might seem even boring, bureaucratic practices that are not observed, or even refusing to record who the visitors are in the White House logs, locking away, which, what about the mystery? There's so many mysteries. And one of the issues with somebody like Trump is there's so many scandals, there's so many outrages that he manufactures that we sometimes can forget about the important stuff. And he's very able at having the scandal du jour to lead us away. So what about the records of the calls with Putin, which were locked up in some special secure area? Why is that? Why has that been allowed to happen? But there's a volume of violations from the legions who have violated the Hatch Act, which seems like child's play, to what has happened in the civil service, that it becomes very hard to police. And I would say that here a precedent was set for a ruler in a democracy by Berlusconi, who had so many violations of conflicts of interest. His right-hand man was convicted by the mafia in 2004. It was upheld in 2014. By then he was gone. There was such a volume of corrupt acts that it became very difficult to comprehend the scale of it all. And people get exhausted. The public gets exhausted. And there's that factor too.
So let's focus on the next couple of. The president called the elections rigged, even before there were any votes cast. Now he's mounting legal challenges, and his administration is not cooperating in the early stages of a transition. Between now and the inauguration, what can we expect from President Trump?
So if history is any guide, we can expect him to, if he thinks he will try and stay in office by any means. And he has very good company helping him to do that. such as William Barr. It took him a while to find his perfect co-conspirators, especially, Attorney General, but he's got them now. But if he thinks he can't stay there, he will be looking in the Pinochet spirit to sabotage the Biden administration as much as possible, and already delaying the authorization of a transition team, which he's done. He does, it's like death of democracy by your bureaucracy. He's expert at that. It means that, what he'd like is the Biden administration has to be saddled by a raging pandemic, a terrible economy, a highly polarized electorate who no longer believes that Biden is even legitimate. He would like more and more people to feel that the whole election is legitimate. And that would stunt the effectiveness of what Biden's able to do. But the real test, I keep looking to the GOP. And I think this is, we want to make it all about Trump, and a lot of it is Trump. But the GOP was already drifting in an authoritarian direction and away from, or we could say, if you don't like that word, away from bipartisan governance, away from democratic values of mutual respect, mutual tolerance for people who think differently. And as happens sometimes in history, what they lacked was a leader to kind of channel and energize and elevate all of these anti-democratic tendencies. So they've fallen in, and I don't see them as a Democratic Party anymore. I see them as an authoritarian leaning party. And the fact that so few senators have accepted the results of the election, again, even Erdogan and other leaders, Netanyahu, they have accepted, they have congratulated Biden, but not our Republican leadership. So that tells you something.
So how did this happen? I mean, we've got a political neophyte who is a question from Bob Hagan. Says, how did a political neophyte turn an entire party into a group of sycophants? Who acted behind the scenes? How did this take place?
I wrote an essay for the New York Review of Books called, they supply the title, but I think it's apt, Co-opt and Corrupt, How Trump Broke the GOP. And I looked at this very question through figures like Lindsey Graham. And he's very interesting because, it's very easy to say, oh, he was blackmailed. But Lindsey Graham's an example of somebody who had a fair amount of rectitude. He was pro-military. He had his values. And then along comes Trump, and he completely turns into a different person. And so there are politicians who actually get a thrill out of working for someone who's lawless, because people say, is there no bottom? Well, no, there is no bottom with men like Donald Trump. There really isn't. There's no law they wouldn't break if they could. And for people like William Barr and Lindsey Graham, that can actually be very thrilling. So it's not just about following orders and becoming a sycophant. It's about feeling, and it's a bleak picture that I'm painting, but it's a bleak scenario. It allows them to have a kind of a lawless political culture that will allow them to do things they've never done in the past. And they feel he's delivered. He's done a lot of things for them in tandem with evangelical Christians. I mean, a lot of things have been accomplished. So, but at the individual level, it is extraordinary, but sadly, just yet another case in the history of authoritarianism that he's been able to transform all of these people into his lackeys and sycophants, as you say.
So let's just say, poof, he disappears. Does Trumpism have a future without Trump? Should we look, for example, for a Trump 2.0, a more savvy candidate, a more focused politician with the skill not to self-destruct?
We could, and some people speculate about who that might be. I think that if we view the GOP as a party that's largely abandoned democratic practices, and I don't mean Democratic Party, I mean democracy. If we view them in that light, they would be only too happy to welcome someone who could protect their gains, because they're politicians. They've accomplished a lot with Trump, and they must be salivating at getting so close to doing what each one has its own vision. You know, for Barr, it's like he kind of a theocracy, a law and order theocracy. Each one has his own games, and Trump paired with all of them, because Trump is a true opportunist. So that is why these men have success. In fact, one conclusion I reach in the conclusion of the book is we like to ascribe a kind of genius. We like to call them like genius strategists. So Hitler was a genius strategist. He had everything planned out. Or Putin, the same thing gets ascribed to him. In reality, these men are supreme opportunists, and they're very able at exploiting historical junctures and being what their partners need them to be. And that's how you get these weird alliances. Like if you think of the alliance of these strongmen with religious institutions, here's Mussolini, who is a total atheist. Long after he stopped being a socialist, he hated the church. He even wrote a novel about a cardinal having a mistress. You couldn't really get more anti-clerical than Mussolini. And he was the one who made the deal with the church and created the Lateran Accords and created Vatican City. In the same vein, really, there's very few individuals that one would think are less suited to pair with evangelical Christians than Donald Trump. For his lack of morals and his lifestyle. But he's been welcomed by Mike Pompeo and Sarah Huckabee Sanders and others as someone who rules with a divine mandate. And this is part of when Pompeo says there will be a second Trump administration, the belief that God has put him in office to save the country. So now I'm not critiquing the religious part of this equation. I'm talking about how only a certain kind of politician will remake themselves to be partners with anyone. And so that is the type of opportunism that you see.
So we have a question from Sona who says, will our institutions survive Trumpism? What about what he calls a domestic Cold War we have in this country? How long will it take? Will his followers resort to violence, something like civil war? What do you expect?
I don't know. One symptom of our sad times is that we were all very frightened about violence around the elections, and then it didn't come to pass.
We're in a block party.
It didn't come to pass, and that was very important to give us some confidence back, because one of the things that authoritarians do is they try and strip our confidence in, not just in our institutions, but in the functioning of our society, that we can even have a society without them. That's why Trump says everything's crappy, you know, when he had his inauguration speech and his acceptance speech of the nomination. He painted America as like a rusted wasteland. And this is designed to make you feel terrible and lose confidence that your country can function properly. So this threat of everything breaking down is something that he weaponizes all the time. And here, I think that it will depend what Fox News does. It's kind of sad we're in the situation to think that Fox News has been the Bible. I actually see Fox News as a co-author of the Trump presidency. I have a quip in the book that, you know, they get an executive producer credit because they've had an influence that they've been like a de facto state media. And a very interesting thing in that regard is Normally you have the kind of leader and then the media parrots him. But Trump is different than all other leaders ever because he doesn't read. Like Berlusconi was Mr. Television, but he read. He read briefing books, he read all kinds of books. Trump doesn't read, and I believe Ivana, his first wife, when she said he only had 2 books at home, he had Art of the Deal and Hitler's Speeches. I think that's probably true. But he gets all of his information about the world from television. And we know from many news reports, he watches up to 7 hours a day. And so he has a feedback loop with Fox, with people like Sean Hannity. So it's not just that Sean Hannity parrots what the presidents say, the president parrots what Sean Hannity says. And so if you think about this, that his tweets often get translated into policy, you know, who is in charge here? Who is the author of these ideas that make policy? It's not always Trump. It's often a TV host. So what Fox does in terms of, to circle back to the violence question, it's really important that Fox accepted the Biden victory. But what hosts like Tucker Carlson, the more inflammatory hosts, do is going to make a difference about how much violence or not we have.
So do you think we could take the plywood off our shop windows or not?
I'm not sure. I think maybe. Things are volatile and we're in an uncertain moment. And this is part of this psychological warfare that Trump and Trumpists are inflicting on us. Authoritarians excel at manufacturing uncertainty and crisis and keeping people in a state of crisis. And meaning uncertainty, and so we don't know whether to take the plywood off. And that's a very sad state to be in, and it's hard to persist for a long time in this state.
There is a man who just won the presidency, and he talks about normal times, a return to normal times, and building back better. Under Biden's leadership, can America recover from the damage you see has been done by Trump and his party?
I hope so. I have no doubt that the Biden administration is competent and will know what to do. Will know the tone to set, will know how to speak. Already you see, we'll have good appointments, competent people. So I have no doubt about competency. I am worried about how they're going to govern. If the Republicans are dead set against them.
What does that mean? Specifically, what are you talking about? How they will govern?
Well, if they will be able to accomplish anything, and what settling into office is going to look like if we're in November and the vast majority of Republican senators have not accepted the fact that Trump lost. So I don't have a problem foreseeing if Biden is able to have his government. I don't know what the next months are going to look like.
So you're an advisor, let's say, we make this up, you're an advisor to the president-elect. What specific things does he need to do? What are the next steps he needs to take to restore the country, in your view?
I think that everybody, often as with difficult or traumatic episodes, it's only when they're over that people can start understanding how they feel and assessing things. So I think that he needs to continue this kind of calm tone. And I think that bridge building is very important. I am a fan of Pete Buttigieg going on Fox News. He's going on Fox News every day. I think this is invaluable because history teaches that there are a sector of voters who perhaps secretly didn't like Trump. They may have voted for him, but they will listen to other points of view. And in order to repair the country and decrease polarization, you must appeal to those people. You can't stay in your silos. That's not benefiting anyone. And one of the reasons I chose as an academic when I started doing this writing to, you know, traditionally there are many academics who will write for the Atlantic or Foreign Affairs, and eventually I did that. But I wanted to write for CNN because you reach so many people. You reach every kind of person. And that's important. And I view what I've been doing as a kind of civic education. In my case, it was always alerting people to what authoritarianism is and how it might be unfolding or not in our country. But I think bridge building and reaching out will be more important than ever.
Do you think the country he's been speaking to has changed or will receptive to that? For example, Ray Terman, he says, many strongmen came to power in the 60s and 70s through military coups, but today they're much more likely to be elected.
Yeah, that's right.
What's the reason for that?
Yeah, that's a really interesting. So one of the tensions in the book was that to see how these people came to power in very different ways, and yet they often installed similar kinds of governance styles, and they had similar temperaments. But the end of the Cold War really spelled the end of the, quote, golden age of military coups. Many of them were backed by the Russians or backed by the United States. And so I feature Mobutu, I feature Pinochet. And the fact that people today come to power via elections this is why I differentiate it as new authoritarianism. And so if you come to power via elections, you must learn to manipulate the system to stay in power. You must learn to manipulate elections. And there are specific things about our period. One of them, of course, is social media, but you see less. I have an example in the book where in old school dictatorships, and this includes military coups, you had a lot of censorship. This was how it had to be. These were things that, you know, they disappear people, they disappear fields of knowledge. But the newer playbook, which Putin is expert and Trump is a follower, you don't just censor people, you create confusion so that people don't know what to believe anymore. And this is something Mussolini wasn't trying to create confusion. In fact, I have an example where in 1939, one of the many, you know, they had rules for the press every day in fascist Italy. 1939, they had a rule that said, you can't have newspaper headlines with question marks because you don't want there to be any question about your meaning. It has to, you know, Mussolini is always right? It has to be declarative. But Putin creates question marks around everything. So you don't know what to believe through conspiracy theories and all the you know, political warfare playbook. And that's what Trump does too. One of the earliest things he did in 2015 is he started saying, we've got to figure out what's going on. We don't know what's going on with immigration. We don't know what's going on with crime. And that caught my attention in 2015 because I thought, well, that's a strange thing to say. Most politicians want to be competent and say, here's what's going on. I have the facts. Trump started a totally different thing. And at the time, I didn't realize what the playbook was. So that's an example of how people come in through elections, but they have to use misinformation much more because they can't just shut down and have a one-party state. That's not as common anymore.
So speaking of misinformation or disinformation, you know, you talked earlier and in your book about newsreels and radio and Mussolini and Hitler. These days, we're all online, it seems, all the time, and there's so much disinformation out there. Is social media itself a problem?
Yeah, and I think that I probably didn't give enough space to the role of, I talk about social media, how it's used by individual rulers, and also how it's used by resistors. There's very interesting things I discovered about, for example, one of the classic scenes of resistance is the police knocking on your door, and you've got to hide your contacts. We never saw that before in the old days. Now, dissidents in Putin's Russia are streaming this. There was a guy who streamed a drone flying out his apartment window with his hard drive in it. So social media has both helped and hurt resistance to authoritarianism. But I think that Facebook in particular was a kind of, a huge help to Trump getting elected. And when you look at the how many ads they ran something like 50 million ads versus 50,000 ads on the Clinton side. They were using an e-commerce model. Andrew Marantz of The New Yorker has written very effectively about this. So in order to assess the power of these strongmen today who are on Twitter all the time with their personal accounts, we do have to take the influence of Twitter and Facebook and Instagram for Modi into account.
Well, I want to thank you both for a fascinating and, I might add, sobering conversation. As always, Richard, thank you so much for moderating and sitting in the armchair so well. And Ruth, I want to stress to our viewers that while you focused a lot on Trump tonight, that the book really is much more than that. And it is so many lessons of history and a real understanding about how strongmen can come to power, and reminding all of our viewers that you can go to interrobangbooks.com to get that 10% discount by just typing in dfwworld. And I hope that you will subscribe to our YouTube channel at dfwworld. And it'd be great if you would share it with your friends and colleagues as well. Thanks so much for watching, and we'll see you again soon. Good night.